Okay, good evening. My name is Dr. Michelle Tovar, and I am Associate Director of Education Latino Initiatives here at Holocaust Museum Houston. Thank you for joining us for our 2021 Genocide Awareness Month lecture. Before we begin, we ask that you please submit your questions for our guest in the Q&A box. We are honored to host tonight's guest, Mr. Fredy Peccerelli, Executive Director of the Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala. Fredy Peccerelli has dedicated his life to upholding human rights and dignity through the application of forensic sciences since his return to Guatemala in 1995. He studied physical anthropology and osteology in Brooklyn College, New York City University, and he studied a master's in forensic and biological anthropology at Bournemouth University, England. Today, as executive director, he leads the development and implementation a multidisciplinary human identification system that applies victim investigation, forensic archaeology, anthropology, and genetics to uncover the identity of victims of mass human rights abuses and the truth behind their disappearances. In recognition of his expertise and decades of dedication to applying forensic sciences to the search for the disappeared, he received an honorary doctorate of laws from the University of Northern British Columbia and an honorary doctorate of sciences from Queen's University. He was the first recipient of the Washington Office on Latin America Human Rights Award, as well as recognized as Time Magazine and CNN's 50 Latin American Leaders for the New Millennium. Thank you again for joining us, and I will go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Peccerelli.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm going to share my screen and set up the presentation. Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here with you today. And, and I want to speak to you about Guatemala and what happened in Guatemala and how we approach this terrible, terrible problem in a country where not many things are taken care of. But let's start by remembering that Guatemala is only one country away from the US, very close to Houston. It's a country with about 37 volcanoes, beautiful. And it's a country with a rich indigenous population. About half the country is indigenous, and more or less about 25 languages, including Spanish, is spoken in Guatemala. And unfortunately, our recent past includes a terrible internal armed conflict that started in 1960 and ended on December 29th, 1996. So it lasted about 36 years. As part of the peace process, the Historical Clarification Commission was formed, and it began an investigation that said that acts of genocide were committed in Guatemala. And what it was a response, an overwhelming response from the state security forces led by the military to a very small insurgent movement. This within the context of the Cold War. And what this left was about 200,000 victims, mostly Mayan victims. And we now know that there was at least 669 massacres committed in communities where very specifically the Mayan communities were targeted because it was believed that that's where the insurgents were hiding and were getting new recruits from. So there was a saying that said basically, Indian seen, Indian killed, Indio visto, Indio muerto. And that was the mentality behind the approach of getting rid of the insurgent movement through designating red zones in Guatemala and annihilating a large part of the population, specifically in the communities. Also, at the same time, in parallel, there was 40,000 people that were disappeared. Now, the disappeared were more individual crimes, and leaders were targeted. So it could be student leaders, church leaders, union leaders, any church leaders, any kind of leader was targeted, usually followed, and eventually captured, tortured, killed, and their bodies hidden. Until this day, many of the 40,000 disappeared, still remain disappeared or remain missing. So some of the numbers of the Truth Commission or the Historical Clarification Commission tell us that about 83% of the victims were indigenous, 17% were non-indigenous, and 93% of the crimes were committed by state security forces. Our numbers are actually a lot higher than this. We're closer to 99% of the crimes were committed by state security forces, and over 90% of the victims were indigenous. So, this is information that came out about 20 years ago, and investigations have continued. And we do have now more information based on evidence, not only on testimony. In the end, what the families want is to be able to say, to find their loved one and say, give them a proper goodbye. Now, with that problem at hand, Guatemala, the families began to form civil society organizations, and they heard of an anthropologist, an American anthropologist that had been to places like Argentina in 1984 or to Chile in 1987. So in 1990, Clyde Snow, whom you see here on the right, who's showing a judge, a justice of the peace, he's actually showing him a bullet inside of that X-ray, and he's beginning to show how to document evidence in the picture on your left. And this is the beginning of the forensic process in Guatemala specific to these crimes. And it's important that we understand that when we are exhuming mass graves of sometimes many years ago, or we're searching for the disappeared, things are a little different. And Clyde, from the beginning, you can see that there is no tape. There's no do not cross crime scene tape. Families are there. They're right next to the graves. He's not wearing protective gear. And this is because Clyde from the beginning understood that he needed to strike a balance between the inclusion of these victims and the scientific effort that needed to go forward. All this done without any support from state agencies. And so Clyde Snow was the person who initially started the forensic anthropology team in 1992, and then eventually we started the FAFG, or the Forensic Anthropology Foundation in Guatemala. I had the privilege of working next to Clyde for about 20 years, and taught me everything from, how to analyze a human skeleton to also how to behave and how to make sure that the families knew that we were there for them no matter what. And I think that's one of the most important things. Now, during these last many years doing this, I've actually been doing this for about 26 years. We have asked families, what do they expect? And obviously still today, even though most of these crimes happened 39, 40 years ago, they still expect to find their loved one alive. There's a saying that I've heard almost in every single country that I've worked in. Si vivos se los llevaron, vivos los queremos. If they were taken alive, we want them back alive. And families have taught us that the most important thing to them is to continue searching for them. And they never lose hope that they're going to find them alive. Now, that does not mean that we shouldn't look for the disappeared among the dead. Right? It just means that if we cannot find them alive, then they hope to recover the body. And once they recover the body, then they begin to think about things like truth, what happened to this person? How did they die? Did they suffer? Were they with anyone else? Who killed them? And that's when we get other things like reparations, justice, and hopefully non-repetition. Now, I know these are the pillars of transitional justice, but they are also what the families actually want. So this is one of those times that reality does come off in this methodology, because it was developed through listening to the families. And now what we have to do is make sure that when we implement, when we search and try to identify these victims, that we respect this and that we understand that we are walking next to families that have been searching for their loved ones for up to 40 years. Now, when we started with forensic anthropology, then forensic archaeology, then victims investigation documentation, and later incorporated forensic genetics. And more recently, we've incorporated confirmation of identification. These are the areas within the FAFG that we use. These are scientific disciplines, some of them, They are very tailored to working with skeletonized remains. And when we work with more recent cases, we obviously include uh, medical doctors or odontologists or fingerprint experts. It really depends on the state of the body. But for us in Guatemala, knowing that all of our cases, most of our cases, um, stem from between 1978 and 1984, then we know we're going to recover dry skeletonized remains. And that's why our main focus is on using forensic anthropology, forensic archaeology to work with the bodies. That's why we have investigators that work with the families, and that's why we have genetics to be able to give us more information that we can compare to try to identify people. Now, what the concept of identification is basically the creation of gathering of information of the person we're looking for. So what we're trying to do is build. The more information we can build on and the more information we can know about the person or persons that we're looking for, the higher the probability is that we can identify them. And so we try to do the same for the bodies. So there's two sets of information, right? There's the person that we're looking for, and there are the bodies that we are finding. And what we're going to try to do is gather as much information as possible on both of them, so then we can eventually make the match and confirm an identification. So let's see the areas that we work in, right? So the first would be the process of documenting and the investigation and documentation of victims. This starts by understanding who we're looking for. Trying to gather as much information as possible about the context of the disappearance, see if there's any information in state archives that might show, as you can see here, that these individuals were being followed and information was being kept on them on secret archives. This is very useful to understand the process, but more useful than that even is to talk to the families. We need to understand who we're looking for. We need to understand if they were, if it was a man, if it was a woman, if they were young, very young, if they were older, how their teeth looked, if they ever had any fractures. So this is the part where we ask about the individual that we're looking for. But also we ask, we also ask about the context. When is the last time the person was seen? Who was the person with, etc. And so we're trying to gain as much information as possible. In this part of the process, we're also trying to learn from the person that we're interviewing about the family. Now, it's important to understand about the family because sometimes there's more than one victim. Well, not sometimes, many times there's more than one victim in each family. And we need to understand the relationships among the different victims and also about the living family members that want to participate in the search process, whether it's by giving us information, an interview, or by giving us a DNA sample. So DNA samples in the past, prior to March of last year, were taken by buccal swabs. You can see here that no one's wearing a mask, so you can see this is pre-pandemic. And we used to take buccal swabs, and we would take that buccal swab, rub that Q-tip inside of the mouth for about a minute, each side of the inside of the cheek, and then rub it onto these FTA cards that basically capture DNA. Now we have just transitioned over, same thing, pretty much the same method, except we're not taking a couple of drops of blood from the hand, from a finger, and placing them on the same paper. But basically what we're looking for is we're looking for family relations to the victim. So in the best case scenario, mother, father, children, or siblings, brothers and sisters. The more people we can have in the family give samples, the higher the probability is that we're going to find them. We don't talk about just one sample or just two samples. We talk about just everyone that can contribute. So sometimes we do have a lot of samples from a family, up to 10, but the average is a little higher than about 2.5. The next part of the process, so while the investigation is going on, while we are receiving information about the victim, what happened, if they're in archives, taking DNA samples, taking information, we're also looking for bodies. Now, in some cases, families suspect where their loved ones could be buried. In the cases of massacres, they know where they are buried. But in the cases of the disappeared, those bodies are hidden. And so we have to just try to recover as many bodies as possible. And this is very difficult sometimes. Sometimes there's open areas like this. And although there are technological advances like ground penetrating radar and other things that we can use, nothing beats a good old excavation of going and not only for finding graves, but you have to remember, families have to trust that we've done everything possible to clear an area so they don't doubt that we've looked there and their body, the loved ones are not there. If we don't do this, the families always doubt that their loved ones could still be in that field and they're going to ask us to come back over and over again. So what we've done is, created a system of a systematic excavation process where we can clear areas and continue to look for graves. Also, as part of the process, the families are there. The families are there. They're witnessing. They're next to the grave, just like you saw in the initial images that I showed you of Cloud Snow in 1990. Well, these are obviously more recent. As we continue to excavate, being very careful, focusing on the body, focusing on the physical evidence, documenting everything along the way. Informs, taking measurements, three-dimensional images are created, when everything's documented forensically. In other words, everything that we're doing is going to be able to be recreated in the court of law if necessary, or for the families. It's important to remember that when we're excavating one of these graves, we're also destroying the archaeological context, so we have to make sure that we document it properly. Sometimes graves are individual, as the one you saw, and sometimes graves are massive. This is a grave of 64 men. And they can be bigger than this, but you can see how complicated this can be. And we have to go step by step because we have to understand. And you can see things in those images, like there's no real order, there's ropes, there's hands behind the back. This tells us a lot of things. And archaeologists are experts in being able to tell, and being able to find these graves and being able to tell us much information from just looking at the graves themselves. You could see in the previous image how there was no order, and you can see how in this one there is specific, everyone is laying on their backs with their hands. There's a little more respect. Usually we would say that the previous image you saw, the grave was probably excavated and filled by the perpetrators, and in this one by people that knew the victims, right? And this helps us also understand how things came to be. Again, always with the families present. Remember, a lot of these graves are in the communities, and they have lived with this for many, many years, many decades. So far, the FAFG has conducted over 1,900, close to 2,000 investigations. So each investigation or case can be either one individual, or in the case you see there, that's one grave of 53 of 220 individuals, and even bigger. So these are massive investigations that take a multidisciplinary approach, a lot of trust from the families. Once we have recovered the remains, we bring them back to our forensic anthropology lab or osteology lab, where a process begins of, we take x-rays of every body, we clean the bones, clean the clothing, label every single bone with a case number. And then eventually an anthropologist is assigned a case, the body's laid out, the skeleton is laid out, and we begin the process of analysis where we are going to try to determine two things. One is the biological profile, again, if this is a man or a woman, the age, and the other is try to understand how they died. So here you can see that it might take days to reconstruct the skull that has been struck, in this case by a high velocity bullet. It's a high velocity gunshot wound. And what this does is it creates massive destruction of the skull, and we have to hopefully recover it properly, right? We have to make sure that every single one of those fragments is recovered, and not only recovered, but associated to this specific body. And that's why the process of identification with the bodies begins in the excavation, in the field, with the archaeologists. Then it continues here in reconstructing these skulls and trying to understand, because not only is this important forensically and for the investigation, for the criminal investigation, but it's also important for the families. The families want to know what happened to their loved one. And a lot of times we also find machete wounds. Here you can see up to 8 different machete wounds. This is very common in Guatemala, unfortunately. And the anthropologists at the FAFG, the forensic anthropologists, are experts in trauma. They see a lot of trauma from the cases that we analyze. Eventually, once the analysis is finished, the last step is to take a small cut, a small window of the posterior part of the left femur, if we can, even, yeah, the left femur. And the idea is that this is what we're going to use to process, to try to extract DNA. So this is a sample, a skeletal sample for DNA. We take a small cut from the back of the femur, as well as an upper molar. So we take usually 2 samples from each body. So far, we've recovered from those 1,975 investigations a total of 8,189 individuals that we know are victims of the conflict. We have also recovered over 16,000 bodies from different cemeteries, with the difference there being that some of those bodies don't belong to victims. And that's just complex. When you excavate a cemetery, sometimes unidentified disappeared people were left in the streets and buried as unidentified individuals, or John or Jane Does. And then those bodies were moved and put into large ossuaries. So what we have to do is recover all of them and try to see if we can separate between the ones that we think can belong to victims of disappeared persons, and then analyze those. So it can get very complicated. So overall, we've recovered close to 25,000 skeletons. Eventually, the samples from forensic anthropology, the skeletal samples, go to the DNA lab, just as well as the samples from the family members that come through the investigation and documentation process. So here you could see bone fragments as they're being processed in the DNA lab. Our DNA laboratory was established in 2008. It has ISO 17025 accreditation since 2010. We are probably one of the first accredited DNA labs in the region, and I mean in the whole of Latin America. And we are probably one of the ones that has the highest output and analyzes the most cases because of the workload that we have in Guatemala alone, although now we're also processing cases from Mexico, from El Salvador, and from other countries. This is the beginning of the process of analyzing a family reference sample here. And basically what happens is that we will take the sample, extract the DNA, amplify specific regions, put them through our genetic analyzers, right, where they're going to be separated by size, and where we're going to get an electropherogram, where we're going to be looking at is repetitions. And I'll show you some of that. And so in specific locations of the genome, we're going to be looking at the alleles, and each one of those numbers come from our parents, right? But we inherit those repetitions from each one from the mother and one from the father. And when we compare this to our families, that's how we can try to match a person into a family. Now, it is important to understand this is not a criminal type DNA database, which works very different. A criminal type DNA database is when somebody commits a minor crime or any crime, you take their sample and you put it into a database. If they commit another crime and their DNA is gathered from that scene, it is compared to the entire database, and then you get a direct match. So a match in a criminal database is usually an identification because it's identical. DNA, our DNA profile is different, it's unique. And so we don't have the victim's profile. So we have to create a family profile and then try to match, try to calculate what is the probability that our victim fits into this family, right? So here you get, for example, in this location, you have 29 repetitions of 31.2. And what this tells us is that in this location, we expect to see the victim that we're looking for should have one of those numbers, right? And by doing that, we can then put that information into we use a database called Emphasis, the Mass Fatality Identification System, created by a company called Gene Codes for the Medical Examiner's Office of New York during the process of the identification of the victims of the World Trade Center. And Gene Codes and its President Howard Cash donated emphasis to the FAFG in 2008, and this has become the workhorse of the lab. This is where we put in all of our profiles, and the software compares them. So we have a total of 16,196 family reference profiles that come from 6,571 families that are looking for 9,340 victims, right? So it's important to understand that. Now, the reasoning is obviously that 6,571 families are looking for 9,000 victims, and that goes back to understanding that there's more than one victim per family. And the number of samples you hope to be a lot higher eventually, because that just tells us, if you can see, it's over 2.5 to 1. So it's because we need more than one sample per family. And here we have close to 3 samples per family, which is good. On the side of the bodies, we have 4,615 bodies with profiles. But the profiles, because the skeletons are degrading in the ground, sometimes we get partial profiles. And what the system does, it unites partial profiles to create one profile that can be compared to the families. And that's why we have more genetic profiles. So we have also about 2.5 profiles per body. But together, those profiles can be searched against the ones, the profiles of the families. And it's complicated, but we do have, fortunately, 3,681 identifications in this process. And when we have an identification, we can then continue the process of notifying the family to eventually come to here, which is giving the remains back. Now, giving the remains back, we work very closely with the USC Shoah Foundation, and its president, Stephen Smith, came to Guatemala once to experience how we worked, and he viewed this process specifically, exactly what you see in this picture. And he said, you know, this is the most humanizing thing I've ever seen. You can actually see how the families witness the victim coming, the body coming together and coming back and gaining its humanity again. And, you know, it took an outsider from the FAFG, a good friend, Stephen, to tell us how he interpreted what he was seeing. Because for us, it was just, you know, doing something that dignifies a victim, but it was much more than that. And this process is very important to the families. It's also very important that we do it, because they trusted us at the beginning with the information, and this is sort of giving them trust right back. And you know, hopefully we can continue to produce the identifications. Obviously, there's a whole there's a process of ceremonies that accompanies every step of the process. And I've mentioned several times that everything we do is centered around the families. Every one of our investigations includes the families in every step of the process. You can see here during an exhumation. We also participate in many ceremonies. This is Rosalina Tuyuk. She's a great friend on our board, and is also the head of Conavigua, which is the largest Mayan widows organization in the country. She is searching for her husband and her father. And she has also been very important to me personally, because she has guided me through what the families expect and our role in it. And participating in the ceremonies is important. It's important to ask for permission from the earth. It's important to ask for permission from the dead. It's important to cleanse us as well. And it's all part of the process. It's part of forensics in Guatemala. It's part of forensics at the FAFG. So we don't only work with the scientific tools we have, but we also have to incorporate into the community. So sharing a meal is very important, because the families want to feel part of this. They want to make this as normal as possible. And we try to. We also have visits to our labs. So community representatives sometimes, well, all the time, come to our offices to see how the cases are doing an analysis, and this generates more trust. And we try to continue generating trust by communicating in a clear, transparent, non-condescending way. And this is important. We speak of DNA openly. We speak of forensic anthropology openly, and families need to understand before they can decide. So someone needs to understand what DNA is and what role they're going to play before they make that very important decision to look for the loved one with their own essence. They're actually looking for the disappeared family member with their own body. And that's a very, very important thing to realize. And it's a very empowering thing to be able to make that decision. And we believe that this builds on trust, and it builds on the understanding of how difficult this process is. Now, the way the work is, I guess, integrated is that civil society organizations, these are legal accompaniment organizations, psychosocial accompaniment organizations, victims organizations, they go to the prosecutor's office and they petition an investigation to be carried out. And they also ask for the FAFG to do it. So the FAFG provides experts, and then the process begins. The prosecutor's office names us as state experts. We begin the process, including the families and including the organization. So we work with civil society organizations, the prosecutor's office, and the families and communities themselves. You can see Ministerio Público is the prosecutor's office. The process always starts there. Here we are returning the remains back to the prosecutors, and then they return them right back to us so we can give them to the families. But it's all within the proper use of chain of custody and within the legal criminal investigation that's being carried out. This can be seen in when we have to provide evidence, present evidence in court cases. Guatemala is still the only country in the world that has taken a former head of state and prosecuted him for the crimes of genocide in its own local courts, in its own national courts. This was General Rios Montt, and the FAFG presented evidence in this case of, I think, 40 of us or so. And so here you see, this is me during the testimony of General Rios Montt. And this is in another case where we're presenting a patterns report, which means that sometimes when we begin to look at these cases, we realize that we can gather information that can lead us to other investigations, and we can begin to see patterns which help the prosecution prove that this was a system. This was a system of disappearance. This was a system of massacres created and executed by the state against its own people. And the evidence is what allows them to be able to do that. The evidence and the testimony. Now, for us, the disappeared, to search for the disappeared includes developing strategies that can help us understand things better. So now we know that the disappeared are mostly either in cemeteries, in clandestine graves are hidden, but a lot of them are in state security installations. I'm going to go a little faster. And there's a big difference between searching for recovering bodies from a massacre and searching for the disappeared. Remember, in Guatemala, we have 160,000 people that were killed. And a lot of them were killed in massacres and extrajudicial executions. And those, a lot of them, the families either buried them or know where they're buried. The people who disappeared, which is the other 40,000, those bodies remain hidden, the majority of them, and we're continuing to search for them. So things are different. You know, one of them, when you know when somebody's buried, it's kind of a closed context. It's a more individual approach. You know that this body could belong to this person, so the process is lineal and fairly straightforward. But when you don't know that information, when you have cases of enforced disappearance, what you have to try to do is gather as much information at the same time, in parallel, from anywhere you can, all the time. And this can be from victims, recover reported victims, skeletons, DNA, archives, and then you put it all together and you begin to match it against each other. You begin to compare it against each other. And this is a massive approach to searching for the disappeared. It's very, very different than traditional forensic approaches, where again, you're doing case by case. Here we have the case is actually the entire country. And because we don't know where people could be, we have to make sure that this information is fed in all the time and compared all the time. And this is what we try to do, have both processes going at the same time. Individual, when you have a hypothesis of who this skeleton could belong to, and when you don't, right? When you don't, you put it in the database, you compare it to every single one of the families. And when you do, you try to see if there's something that is individualizing in that specific body and compare it to that specific family. So it's a process. Here, I'm going to go really quickly. This is Guatemala City, Cobán, which is sort of in the middle of the highlands. We had it was a case where we had to do execute a search warrant inside of a former military base. Actually, no, I'm sorry, not a former military, a functioning military base. It was formerly a military base, and now it's a training base for United Nations Blue Helmets, peacekeepers, but it's still run by the military. We went in there within 2 hours. We found the first of 85 graves in different locations. Most of them were found in site 1, which you see in the middle, about here, and then site number 5. But we were there for about 2 years, excavating in all those areas. In total, we found 85 graves and a minimum number of 565 individuals. This has been called by the former Attorney General the largest specific case of disappearances. These are individuals that were disappeared and their bodies are hidden inside of a military base that is later used as a peacekeepers training facility. It's ironic, I know, that peacekeepers that are going to go to Congo and other places that the UN has peacekeepers and are training on top of the victims of disappeared persons in Guatemala. Most of the victims are adults, but there are some children, younger adults. There's a lot of trauma. Circumortem or perimortem trauma was seen in 113 out of 565 bodies. There's a lot of cut wounds, and there's a lot of, you can see 46 cut wounds to the cervical area. That's the neck. There was a lot of, that was a very specific way of executing people. You could also see that there was 395 different means of immobilization, whether it's ropes, ligatures, blindfolds, gags. You can see 213 of the bodies had blindfolds. Immobilization is a sign of torture. And here you can see that there's many other crimes happening that lead up to the disappearance. But remember, this is all happening within a military base, which, our own military, which is supposed to protect us. While the excavation's happening, many families, 761 families, came to us and reported 982 victims in this region. So in parallel, the archaeologists are recovering the bodies and the investigators are taking information from families, most of them in that region. And again, we're building on both sets of information to try to confirm identifications. Overall, we currently have 169 victims have been identified through DNA in this process. Well, I shouldn't say through DNA, through a multidisciplinary approach, because DNA on its own would not be able to do this. This is an effort of the investigators, the archaeologists, the anthropologists, the geneticists, and then our guys in confirmation of, and girls from confirmation of identifications, making sure everything is right. Most of the bodies that we have identified, of the people we have identified, come from a very specific region, which is the same area of coverage that military base had. And that leads us to understanding what is happening, right? To try to understand what's happening. So we can see things like, for example, was this person alone? Was it in a group? Was this person taken as an individual? And we have to look at time and space, right? Events of disappearance, when, where, how many, who's the victim and who's the perpetrator, and events of interment, in other words, the graves. So on one side, you have information coming from the families, and on the other side, you have information coming from the bodies. When we compare this information, it leads to more and more information that we can process to let us to help us understand. This is a quick example, grave number 5. So far in this grave, we have 37 bodies. We have identified 10. But the dates of disappearance are different. They range from May 4th, 1981 to May 25th, 1982. That's a year. That's 13 months. And you know, the first thing you might think is that that grave was open and it was reused. It wasn't. It was a single event. And so we have to, as a single event, which is what our archaeologists tell us, we have to assume that the most recent date was the date of burial. Now, again, we have to assume. We don't know that yet. We would not know the exact dates till we have all 37 victims identified. But what that does allow us to do when we speak of pattern analysis is to count if from these 10 individuals, I assume as an exercise that Santiago Mo, which was, he was disappeared on May 25th, 1982. We'll say that as day 0. That's when the grave was dug. But Felipe K. Lopez disappeared on May 4th, 1981. That means Felipe was detained for 386 days prior to his body being put in that grave. That means that this place was also holding people alive for long periods of time before executing them and putting them in these graves. Now, again, we'll be able to do this analysis with all the bodies and all the graves as we continue the identification process. But there's more information in here than what that we thought. The way we have to think about this is the more skeletal remains we recover and the more family reference samples we have, the higher the probability of a match, of an identification, again, in the massive system. Many reasons why there could be more identification. One of them is that the family genetic information is not complete. Other is that many families have not given a sample yet. Others is that the remains are old and they're degraded. So we have to continue to incorporate new DNA technologies, and we're doing that. Now, I've explained to you what we do in Guatemala. We're now taking this, as Clyde would say, on the road. Clyde was always a believer of creating local capacity. We are an example of that in Guatemala, and we have a responsibility to share what we've learned with everyone, everywhere. Currently, we are working with 4 search commissions: the Office of Missing Persons in Sri Lanka, the Unit of the Search of the Disappeared in Colombia, the Commission, the National Commission for the Search of the Disappeared in El Salvador, and the National Commission for the Search of the Disappeared in Mexico. We have also in the past gone to Bangladesh and worked with the Rohingya population, trying to understand if they would be willing to start a process of creating a DNA database. And we went through the whole process and explained to them, again, what DNA was. They explained to us what happened, and we asked them if they wanted to participate, and they did. So we'll be going back there with Erica in the next year or so and begin to take DNA samples in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh of the Rohingya population. Hopefully one day we'll get access to the bodies and we'll be able to identify some people there. We also have the Forensic Academy, which is an effort to invite people from the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia to come to Guatemala so we can share with them in the labs, with families, and overall, the strategy of the FAFG is growing day by day, and it all stems from working with the families and the multidisciplinary approach. And so that's it, Michelle. I think I'm done. So I hope it wasn't too much, and I guess I'll open it up for questions now. Also, please, if you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, webpage is there.
But thank you again for your incredible work. We do have many questions actually from our audience. A very important question that was put out is denial of the genocide, particularly from perpetrators responsible for the atrocities, is still occurring in Guatemala. How has FAFG dealt with denial and or distortion of this history?
Well, it's very difficult for us. I mean, this is probably one of the first presentations that I actually mentioned the word genocide, because we can be attacked for this in court as, you know, taking sides. We try to stay in the middle. For us, it's joining with the right partners like the USC Shoah Foundation. Uh, we started a process of um, uh, life histories. So we are also recording life histories outside of the forensic process so that families can tell their own stories, and they can, you know, and that's one of the ways that we are documenting the genocide. Now there is, you know, we testified in a trial that led up to the conviction for genocide that was later, I don't know, I don't want to say overturned, because it wasn't overturned. It was sort of returned to an earlier part of the process. So what we're doing is continuing to search for the disappeared. We have to walk a very fine line in Guatemala. So what we try to do is stay within science and try to be objective and listen to the family's needs and do this, try to educate. Anyone who just wants to open their eyes is welcome to just take a look at this and can come to their own conclusion pretty quickly. So I think we have to make sure the information's out there.
Our next question asked, have new methods been discovered to improve the process of finding the missing, excuse me.
New methods. Well, I think the multidisciplinary approach is a new method into the traditional forensics, which is usually not the way things work. They work very separate. And what I mean, traditional forensics is very focused on investigating current crimes. I think the nuance here is incorporation of the families into the process. That's not something that's done in traditional forensics. And of course, right now we are in the process of incorporating massive parallel sequencing, which is a new DNA technology, which instead of looking at 24 regions of the human genome, we'll be looking at several hundred regions, and we'll be able to tell many more things. But again, those very specific technical scientific tools are useless if you don't have the families. So that's why this is, I think that's probably the most innovative incorporation of the process, the incorporation of the families with this multidisciplinary approach. Because in the end, we will use whatever technical expertise we need according to the case, right? So if we need medical experts, we use those. We need odontologists, we use those. And we need a fingerprint expert. But the majority of our cases rely on anthropology, archaeology, the investigators, and genetics.
And speaking of families, there was someone that asked early on if you have an example of an interaction with a family member or family that you remember again and again.
Well, there's several things that I remember. My very first case in 1995, which was Cuarto Pueblo, was during the conflict, and it was in a zone that still had the armed fights. There was still war, and we were there. Like I grew up in New York, and I had just come back to Guatemala, and I really thought, what the hell did I get myself into? I mean, there was mines everywhere. We could hear the fighting at night on the other side of the hill that we were excavating in one valley where there had been a massacre of 424 people. And on the other side of the mountain, there was fighting going on every night. And my interaction, the one that I remember, was the first thing I had to do was interview about 50 families. There was only 5 of us then. And we had to set up our camp because this place was I mean, after driving 10 hours, you had to walk another 6 hours in the tropical forest, the jungle, and cross rivers. I mean, I wanted to be Indiana Jones, I thought. And then I was like confronted with the reality of having to do these things that I'd never imagined. And then I was confronted with the reality of what happened, the families. Listening to how, we set up our camp in a former cardamom drying facility that they had there. So they had like cement beams that kind of held up the roofing, and all that had been torn down. So we kind of built it back up so we could have a roof and we put our tent under there. My tent, I was a new guy, was next to like the outer part. So it was next to one of those beams. And as I was interviewing the families, they kept saying yes. And the children, they would take the children by their arms and legs and they would slam their heads into that beam. And they kept pointing to that beam. That's where my tent was. And they said that there was a puddle of blood, like around the beam. And I couldn't, till now, I slept in that puddle of blood, obviously years later, but oof, that marked me. I mean, probably forever.
That does lead me to a question of someone's asking about, first they said, thank you for your very important work that you're doing in Guatemala. Although this work is necessary, it must be very emotional and difficult. What supports or motivates you to continue this heavy work?
I feel like I was very fortunate that my family could just get on a plane and go to the Bronx. you know, at the South Bronx in the 80s was not probably not safer, but we were out of Guatemala. And then the problems was something else. But I was very fortunate that I got a okay education, a good education, and I just felt that I had to. I started because I just wanted to see. I didn't know. I grew up in a bubble. I had no idea what happened in Guatemala. I think most people have no idea what happened in Guatemala. But for me, being Guatemalan, it was really important. And then I got to Guatemala and listened to those testimonies, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility came over me of saying, I can do something. I have to do something. It's my responsibility to do something. Um, and that has been the thing that has driven me for all these years, that I feel like I have the responsibility to not only continue training people to do this, we can do this. We can give an answer to these families. These are families, we're basically the last people they can go to, because in Guatemala, there's no state support for this. And even in countries where there is state support for this, like Colombia, Mexico, and others, they don't, they're not really focused on the families. And we can focus on the families and we can explain to them. They can feel included. They can feel like the name of their loved one matters. Even if we don't find them, they can they can search with their own DNA. Like those things matter. And what I feel the work does, it empowers people. Sometimes it finds people. A lot of times we find the disappeared. But if we don't, people are changed and they're empowered by this work overall, including myself.
That's incredible. Well, here at the museum, we try our best to educate, outside of the curriculum. We want to teach about these genocides and things that have occurred afterwards. But how can you, through your recommendation, how can educators discuss this important history in their classroom while being sensitive to the trauma faced by victims and their family?
I think, I don't know how. I'm not an educator. I mean, I didn't train to be an educator, but we have the responsibility. I mean, I've been to many courses in The Hague and other places. Guatemala is not part of the curriculum. They speak of Argentina, they speak of Chile, they speak of many other places, South Africa, but we're not part of that. And there's other places that are not part of that. So I think in the US, just look what's happening now. The migrant population that's moving up to the US, that's crossing Mexico under all those dangers, that's trying to get into the US, stems from the crimes committed in the conflict. The fact that they're marginalized and there are no opportunities in Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras comes from that time. And so I think it's important to teach why people are attempting to migrate to the US. It's important to teach because it's part of history. It's also important to teach because, the US governments supported the military and I think in Guatemala, including the 1954 coup, overthrew a democratically elected president. I mean, and I understand that this happened a long time ago, but maybe proper reparations have not been I don't know what proper reparations would be when you do that, because basically they change the course of a country forever. And now, um, we're living with the repercussions of that. I would say incorporate it with, and that's one of the things that we love about the Shoah Foundation and working with them, because uh, we're trying to incorporate those life histories into the eyewitness platform, so that there are lesson plans created so that teachers have those tools to be able to talk about Cambodia, and to be able to talk about Rwanda, and to be able to talk about Guatemala, and to be able to talk about the Holocaust about in the same time. And you know this, but when children begin to see this, they don't see the difference. All these victims were targeted in the same way, and I think they should all be, and that's why I accepted your invitation, because I think it fits in perfectly with 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 the Holocaust, right? When we speak of the Holocaust, or we speak of Holocaust education, um, what happened in Guatemala is it's very similar.
Thank you so much. We do have one last question. What can the public do to support your work?
Well, like I mentioned, there's many things we can do. And I'll be blunt about the first one. You can donate, because we do work from using donations, and donations from governments, and donations from foundations, and donations from individuals. You can go to our webpage, and there is a donate button, FAFG.org. And we are very appreciative of that. But you can also share our post, invite us to speak in events, uh, try to come to Guatemala, talk about Guatemala, and talk about families everywhere. This unfortunately continues to happen. We get requests from Syria all the time. We get requests from um, South Sudan, Lebanon, and besides all the countries that we're working in now, I mean, Nepal. There's a need to support families of disappeared persons everywhere, and I think the example of Guatemala is a good one, because even without any support, we can show the world that it can be done. And if we can do it, anybody can do it. At least that's my way of seeing it, right? That we're one of those examples that you don't expect. You don't expect, there's not many things that are great that come out of Guatemala, at least not publicly known, right? Yes, we have good rum, and yes, we have great coffee, but we also have great people. And the FAFG, and the FAFG, with all the organizations we work with, and the trust that the families have given us, is what allows us to be able to share that.
Thank you so much. I did want to add, we have an amazing program here at the museum called Educator in Motion, led by Lori Garcia, and she uses some of your work in her teachings with higher level students, and it's incredible the work that she's been doing. So I hope that we can send your message through her work. Again, thank you for joining us. This has been incredible, and thank you to our viewers for joining us tonight. We hope that you can join us beginning April 30th for the exhibit of Withstand Latinx Art in Times of Conflict. This juried exhibition investigates the idea of resistance and its multiple ramifications in the visual arts, as well as the impact of political and/or social conflict on the creative process. For more information, please visit our website at hmh.org Withstand to learn more. I've also added the links to FAFG onto the chat if you can grab those quickly. And also follow us on Instagram at Boniac Center and at HMHOU. Thank you again, Fredy. I appreciate you for your time and everything that you're doing. Please have a great evening.